Oops. Okay.
Alright, so this section is going to talk about, not Andrew Johnson, that's the other one, Lyndon Johnson, after he becomes president. So just a little bit about him. He was born and raised in Texas, and he actually started out as a teacher. And most of the time he worked in very small rural areas that had large Mexican American populations. And so they were basically discriminated against just the same as black schools were. And so they were very poor. They didn't have all the resources and materials that they needed either. But he turned to he became a politician, and not just any politician. He was a master politician. There were people who said, and this was before he became president or vice president, that he was the most powerful man on Capitol Hill. He was instrumental in getting the Civil Rights Act of 1957 passed. And even though he did that, when he became president, people were kind of like, I'm not sure where he stands on this. Just because he was a white Southerner, and you know, the history of that is not always good. But he eventually became JFK's vice president, and some of the reasons that people believe in the conspiracy theory that Johnson had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, it's because Johnson and Kennedy did not like each other. The only reason that Johnson was chosen as his running mate is because Kennedy was a Northerner and he was Catholic. And a lot of Southerners would not vote for him. But they would vote for Johnson because he was a Southern Protestant.
And Johnson didn't like losing.
No, Johnson did not like losing. He didn't lose, hardly ever. It wasn't in the cards for him. And so because of Johnson being on the ticket, that's one of the things that pushed Kennedy forward and allowed him to win the presidential election. Now, Kennedy's legacy. You guys know, and we've already talked about it, that Johnson, after Kennedy's death, he said, listen, the best way we can honor this president is to pass this civil rights legislation in honor of him. So they did. And as we discussed earlier, it outlawed discrimination in public areas. Now, does that mean that all discrimination ends? No. But legal segregation has come to an end. Legal segregation. Okay. In addition, it established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So if somebody is discriminating you because of your race or maybe even your gender, you can turn them in to the EEOC, an investigation will be done, and then there can be punishments for those if they did violate your civil rights. But Johnson, he kind of does his own thing once he becomes president. He plays off of what Kennedy did, but he was very passionate about fighting a war on poverty. And so I told you guys the other day that part of Kennedy's agenda was to give middle class tax cuts. He proposed that, but it didn't actually get passed while he was president. There were some issues and hurdles to getting that done, but as I said, Lyndon Johnson was a master politician and it did get passed while he was president. Then we have the passage of the Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. This did several things. It created the Job Corps. The Job Corps would provide training to young people for work. So you guys probably know this, but in high school you learn your basic studies. You know, biology, history, math, science, all of those types of things, English. And essentially the goal of that, and I'll just say this, my opinion, is to make sure that when you guys graduate high school, that you're not ignorant idiots. That you have some concept of, you know, you're a learned person or an educated person. But you guys probably also know that just going to high school probably doesn't always prepare you for a specific occupation. Okay? You have to learn skills to do specific occupations. So what the Job Corps would do is they offered opportunities like that. Maybe you need to take a typing course or some other kind of class that's going to teach you what you need to do in order to get a job. You could get that through the Job Corps. They probably even help you figure out how to fill out your W-2s and all that kind of stuff if you don't know how to do that. The next program is Volunteers in Service to America. The best description of this I can give, it's like the Job Corps, it's like the Peace Corps, except it's here in the United States. So we sent volunteers all over the country into places where they had high amounts of poverty. And these volunteers are going to help people, I'll help you go find a job, or I will help you apply for health insurance, or I will, volunteer in this community shelter and things like that to try and help urban cities mostly. And then we have Head Start. Head Start is a program, and it's actually still around. It was designed to give free daycare to low-income families. Head Start's awesome. I actually tried to get my kids into Head Start, but they didn't have any openings left, so I was kind of bummed about that. But they have spots for low-income families that they reserve, but then when they have extra space, they open it up to anybody. So potentially anybody could benefit from Head Start. But it's not just like dropping your kid off and it's like, oh, we'll see you later. Head Start, they do things with your kid. They work with your kid and try and, prepare them a little bit so when they go into elementary school, they're not behind or anything like that. Great program. So Johnson was only president for 1 year before he had to run for re-election, even though he didn't actually get elected as president, but you guys know what I mean. So in this election, he is the Democratic nominee. He is going to talk about fighting his war on poverty, civil rights, and he wanted a strong federal government. His opponent is Barry Goldwater, who was a Republican. Now, Barry Goldwater, he opposed government spending, but he also was a states' rights guy, which means he wanted the state governments to be as powerful, if not more powerful, than the federal government. And the reason why, and I don't know about him specifically, but the reason why a lot of people who voted for him did so is because they wanted the states to have the ability to discriminate against people. Like, we want our state to be able to keep blacks from voting or blacks from doing this. So, as a result, who do you think is probably going to vote for him? What states?
Alabama.
Yeah, the Deep South. Okay? But the Democrats, they won. And they didn't just win, they won big in this election. All of the blue states were won by LBJ. Arizona is traditionally a hardcore Republican state. It almost always goes Republican. But as you can see, he won the Deep South. Barry Goldwater did. Everywhere else was Lyndon Johnson. And it really wasn't even close. But they didn't just win the presidency, they won the House of Representatives and also the Senate. And that really doesn't happen all that often, I guess. But when it does happen, it's more likely that legislation will be passed because the same party is in control of everything. Okay, so Johnson, once he gets reelected, every president has to name their plan and their course of action. He calls his the Great Society. It is his goal to end poverty and racial injustice by giving people opportunities. And some of these opportunities include healthcare. He wanted people to have access to health insurance. So I believe this plan was started in 1965. Don't quote me on the year, but it's right in that area somewhere. It gave basic insurance for people ages 65 and older. And you guys have to realize that most of the time, if you have health insurance, you get it through your employer because they pay part of it, you pay part of it. So if you don't have a job, retired people, it might be more difficult for you to get health insurance. That's why we have Medicare. We also have Medicaid, which gives basic insurance for poor and disabled people. Again, if you don't have a good, I'm not saying that if you don't get insurance through your job, it's not a good job, but usually you have to have like a salary job or a higher paying job in order to get health insurance through your work. So if you're poor, you may not have that opportunity. So we have Medicaid to provide basic health insurance. Then there's education. LBJ was a teacher. Children and learning were near and dear to his heart. So he got, and I don't remember the name of it, it's like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. But what it did, it provided funding for poor schools so they could actually have a library. They could build language learning labs. So like those schools in Texas that he worked at where, all of your students might speak Spanish and you only speak English. That way you can, teach each other how to speak these different languages and you can communicate with one another.
And now Texas is super smart.
That's debatable. It is Texas after all. Anyhow, okay, now let's talk about the environment and the consumer. So a book came out, and it was called Silent Spring. And in this book, Rachel Carson, she's like, oh my gosh, there's pesticides and there's chemicals in the water because there's no government regulation. You're drinking chemicals. So needless to say, everybody was pretty freaked out by that. So the government passed the Water Quality Act and then the Clean Water Restoration Act. And what these basically did, long story short, they made sure that our drinking water is clean. It put regulations on businesses and companies so they can't be dumping chemicals and pesticides into our drinking water, basically. Oh, and then got another book that came out by Ralph Nader. Nader, like a tornado. He ran for president later.
Nader later.
Yeah, Nader ran later. But anyhow, this book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. And they called out the automobile industry and said, hey, listen, automobile manufacturers, they don't care if you live or die in their cars. As long as you buy one, they're good with it. And they said there's a lot of problems with that. So the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act was passed, and this is going to be when they first start requiring the automobile industry to do safety tests and have certain regulations in place to make sure, hopefully, we're not killing people.
Is that why we have seatbelts now?
Seatbelts are going to come a little bit later, I believe. But it's going to be something along those lines, yes. Okay. Now, let's talk about immigration. I don't know if you guys remember when we talked about the 1910s and the 1920s, but we had immigration quotas so that people from countries we didn't like Eastern Europe, they couldn't send very many people here. And honestly, those immigration laws were outdated and they were very discriminatory. So, we passed the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965. It is going to do away with those old quotas. And as a result, it opens up our country to a lot more people from Latin America and a lot more people from Eastern Europe. Okay. The next thing is the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. And honestly, the legacy of Lyndon Johnson is kind of tainted by the Vietnam War, which we haven't talked about yet. We're going to talk about in the chapter when we get back from spring break.
Oh, heck yeah.
But yeah, the Vietnam War kind of put like a dark cloud over his presidency, and he will decide not to seek a second term for re-election. But one thing that he would probably be most proud of as president is that while he was, because of his programs and things that he did as president, poverty in America declined by 10%, which is pretty impressive. All right, so now let's talk about the Supreme Court. I know, we're getting close to being done. The Warren Court, it's called that because Earl Warren is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they became the most liberal court in American history. Some of the things that they did, and in my mind this is not real radical, but one of the things they did was reapportionment. They rearranged electoral voting districts based on population shifts, which that only makes sense. You know, if Oklahoma at one time back in 1907, we had a bigger population than California, it wouldn't make sense if we still had like 50 electoral votes and California only had 6. That wouldn't make any sense. So they have to reapportion things based on your population. But these are just a couple of the court cases. I promise you those 2 court cases will not be on your test. Okay, then we get into the rights of the accused, and this is going to be something that's on your test, okay? And this comes down to Mapp versus Ohio, legally obtained evidence only. Have any of you guys watched like Law and Order or CSIs or anything like that? Okay, you know that in order to use evidence in a court of law, it has to be legally obtained evidence. So if I think that Alonzo murdered Miss Wilson, okay? I think that he murdered Miss Wilson, but I don't have any proof or anything to, implicate him. I'm like, all right, while Alonzo is in his 4th hour class, I'm gonna break into his car, put a wiretap in there, and then, that way I can eavesdrop on him. And then if Alonzo on that wiretap says, yeah, I killed Miss Wilson, it was fun, okay? I cannot use that in a court of law because I did not get a warrant that said I can wiretap his car.
Hold on. So wait. If someone were to kill someone and they had the murder weapon in their house and you broke into their house and found the weapon, you couldn't use that in a court of law?
The
because-
police couldn't. Like, maybe if